Good evening. I'm Stella Silianidu, a student from the University of Washington's Engage program, here to welcome you to our event tonight. As a graduate student, I get specialized training in how to do a very specific type of research. The Engage program gave me another type of training that graduate students rarely get. I learned how to talk about my science in a way that's engaging, enlightening, and informative. You can learn more about our innovative program at engage-science.com. And now to our first guest. Youngblom is a PhD student in the Institute of Public Health Genetics at UW. Tonight, she'll be talking about a genetic condition called brittle bone disease, how it can be mistaken for child abuse, and the ramification of this error. Please give a warm welcome to Youngblom.
Thank you for that introduction. As Stella said, my name is Emily Youngblom. I'm a student at the University of Washington. And I'd like to tell you a bit about a condition called brittle bone disease and child abuse, how these two things are similar and why they're sometimes difficult to tell apart. Now, to get into this, I'd first like to tell you a story. I'd like to talk about these children in this picture. This is Bethany and Harrison. This is a fairly recent picture of them, but the story actually takes place about 4 years ago when Harrison was only 6 weeks old. His parents took him to the hospital because they thought that he had a cold. But while he was at the hospital, he underwent a series of x-rays that showed that he had 8 separate fractures in his arms and his legs. Because of this, his sister was also tested and she was found to have multiple bone fractures as well. Because of this, the parents of the children, Paul and Amy, were very quickly arrested on account of child abuse. The children were removed from their home and they were sent to foster care, where the parents were only allowed to visit them for a maximum of 6 hours per day under direct supervision. This went on for about 1.5 years. While this was going on, the mother was looking around for other possibilities, other reasons that could have caused the bone fractures, and she was coming up short-handed. It took about 1.5 years before a new piece of evidence came in that proved that the parents, Paul and Amy, actually hadn't been abusing their children. Part of the reason that this went misdiagnosed is because, unfortunately, worldwide, child abuse is extremely ubiquitous. In fact, in the United States alone, every year, there are approximately 650,000 cases of confirmed physical child abuse every single year. And we know that there are many more that go unreported. In fact, about 80% of these, the 650,000, is a cause of the parents or the direct caregivers abusing their children. But when a child goes to the hospital and they're found to have broken bones that the parents can't explain, child abuse isn't the only cause of that. The condition that I study is called brittle bone disease. There are a lot of similarities between brittle bone disease and child abuse, such as broken bones. And because of this, brittle bone disease often gets misdiagnosed as child abuse. The problem with misdiagnosis of brittle bone disease as child abuse is that it can be extremely emotionally traumatizing. This is true both for the parents who have their child taken away from them unnecessarily, as well as for the child who is being taken away from their parents. If they're old enough, they're being taken out of their school and away from their friends. If they're young enough, they're being taken away from their regular feeding schedule or their nap schedule. What a lot of people don't realize is it's also extremely expensive to have a child in foster care. So for one child in a single year to have a child in foster care, it costs about $40,000. Usually the government is paying for this, so this is American taxpayer dollars that are going into taking care of a single child in foster care. And as we talked about in the story at the beginning of Bethany and Harrison, that was 2 children in foster care for 1.5 years. So it is extremely expensive on the United States to have these children unnecessarily in foster care. Annually, it costs the United States about $22 billion to keep all the kids in foster care. And this number comes from the approximately 550,000 children annually who are in foster care in the United States. Those are some of the problems, the emotional trauma and financial burden of having a child who has brittle bone disease, who's misdiagnosed as having child abuse, but it can also be problematic if the misdiagnosis goes the other way around. So if a child who has been abused is now told that they have brittle bone disease and they're being sent back to their parents, if their parents are abusive, this could lead to further injury or possibly to death. Every year in America, there are about 1,640 deaths caused from child abuse alone, and this equates to about 4 to 5 children per day who are dying as a result of child abuse. The way that we look for the way that we determine if a child has brittle bone disease generally comes down to genetics. And the reason that it's difficult to determine if a child definitely has brittle bone disease is because as a field, genetic testing is fairly recent. You've probably heard about DNA testing in court cases from a variety of different sources. It first came about in the 1980s. This is a picture of Colin Pitchfork. This is an Englishman from Leicester who committed a double rape murder, and he was the first to be convicted using DNA evidence. So since the 1980s, the use of DNA testing in court cases has begun to expand. Paternity testing is the most common way that we see genetic testing used in court cases. This is extremely ubiquitous. You see it from everyone from Justin Bieber to Thomas Jefferson who's had paternity testing, so it is very widely used. It's also become much more popular from the popular TV series CSI. This is crime scene investigation. So this is using DNA found in specimens left at a crime scene like blood or semen to try to determine who the perpetrator might have been. We've also got this new technology coming out now. This is facial reconstruction. And the idea here is that if a sample is left at a crime scene that has DNA in it, the scientists can use the DNA found from that specimen to try to reconstruct what the person might have looked like. So you can see in the picture here, they have done an okay job of using genes related to facial morphology and ancestry to try to reconstruct a picture of what that person probably looked like. And you can see in the picture that they are getting pretty close, but they still have quite a ways to go before we can use this properly. So brittle bone disease can be undistinguishable from child abuse, but in some cases it isn't difficult to tell them apart. And this is because brittle bone disease has a very wide range of severity, from people who are so severe that they get hundreds of broken bones in their lifetime, maybe so severe that while they're still in the womb, before they're born, they're already getting broken bones. Here are two pictures of fairly prominent people that you may have heard of that have both been very open about having brittle bone disease. On the left is Australian comedian Stella Young, and on the right is American actor Michael J. Anderson from the TV show Twin Peaks, and both of them have a condition of brittle bone disease more on the severe end. They're both quite short. Stella Young is wheelchair bound, and the problem here is that their bones break so frequently that when the bones are trying to rebuild, they often don't build straight because they are broken so often. So these two are more on the severe end, but you also have people on quite a mild end, and you may not even know, or these people themselves might not know that they have brittle bone disease. This is another American actor, Atticus Shaffer. He's from the TV show The Middle, and he also has brittle bone disease, but he's got a much more mild case of it. So he is of normal stature. The only difference is that he happens to get more broken bones, more fractures than the average person. So the problem with people like Atticus Shaffer, if they do have a very mild case of brittle bone disease, is that if they don't know that they have it, or their family doesn't know that they have it, if they indeed do end up having a number of broken bones, when they go to the hospital, it's much more common for a physician to suspect that they're being abused than to suspect that they have a very rare disease. So, brittle bone disease, as I've said before, is extremely rare as opposed to child abuse, which is extremely common. So here's an analogy for why the more common thing tends to get diagnosed more often than something that is more rare. So let's say you've stepped outside of your house and you see these paw prints in the ground. And it's very easy for us to think to the first thing, the most common thing that could cause this. So you think to yourself, well, I've seen this before. I know exactly what caused the paw prints. It must be a dog. And that's fine because most of the time you're right. And it really isn't a problem if you think that paw prints are dogs when they really aren't a dog's paw prints. But the thing is, sometimes something else might have caused those paw prints. Maybe it was a wolf, for example. So in the case of brittle bone disease, when a physician sees something and they know of something extremely common that causes exactly that symptom, it's very easy for them to diagnose them with having the most common thing and maybe not think of all the things, all the possibilities that might have caused that. So with brittle bone disease and child abuse, it's 24 times more likely that a child who has broken bones has those broken bones due to child abuse as opposed to due to brittle bone disease. So you can see why physicians would jump there. Some of the things that a physician might look for when they are trying to determine if something is brittle bone disease or child abuse are different symptoms or signs that might come with one or the other. So here's a list of a couple of different things that might either be associated with brittle bone disease or associated with child abuse. But on either side of this dividing line, none of these things have to come with either one of these conditions. So, for example, with brittle bone disease, if a person has brittle bone disease, they might have blue sclera. The sclera is the white part of your eye right around that colored iris. And in a person with brittle bone disease, their sclera might, instead of being white, might be blue or maybe have a grayish tint to it. They also might have very small teeth. They might be triangular or shaped in their mouth a little bit differently. But with both of these things, with blue sclera and small teeth, just because a person has brittle bone disease does not necessarily mean that they also have blue sclera or small teeth, but finding one or the other might be more indicative that they have brittle bone disease. If a child is being abused, a physician might look for some of these things: a bonk on the head, a burn, particularly a burn in a shape, like in the shape of a cigarette burn, bites anywhere on the body, or bruises, particularly bruises that come in shapes, again, maybe the shape of a shoe. So if a child is being abused, they do not necessarily have all of these 4 things. They might not have any of these other 4 things. But the problem is that with brittle bone disease and child abuse, generally, most of them have some kind of broken bone. So if that's the only clue that you get for a child, that they have broken bones, and there are no other signs or symptoms, it can be really difficult to distinguish whether they have brittle bone disease or child abuse. So I want to talk a little bit about the cause of brittle bone disease, and to do that, I'm going to have to talk a bit about genetics. So to make sure everyone's on the same page about some of the words I'm going to say, I'll take you back for a minute to a cell. So in this cartoon drawing right here, I've got a cartoon picture of a cell. Those squiggles in the middle, that's the DNA. So I'll just zoom in on this cell, have a close look up at the DNA. You can see what kind of shape it's got. It's this double helix. You may have heard that before, just 2 strands coiled around each other. And generally speaking, when somebody says gene, all they mean is a section of the DNA that holds some kind of information for how to make some kind of part of your body. So that's, broadly speaking, what I mean when I say gene. What a gene does is holds information to make a protein. So it will have some kind of instruction on there. It'll turn into a protein. And for purposes of this talk, the protein that I'll be talking about is a protein called collagen. Collagen is the protein that makes your bones strong. So it's shaped similar to DNA in a helical shape. It's 3 strands intertwined around each other, and it's those 3 strands twisted around each other that make it really strong. So you think of a rope, they tend to be in strands that are wrapped around each other, and that's what makes the rope really strong. So with collagen, there's this triple helix, it's called. The helix is the spiral shape, triple because it's 3. And if there's a mistake in the gene, what tends to happen is you lose that shape in the middle of collagen. So instead of those 3 strands being wrapped around each other, now it's straightened out, and that isn't nearly as strong as when the 3 strands are wrapped around each other. So losing the shape of this collagen is what's going to cause the bones to be more fragile than they might have been if they were all wrapped together. So when we're looking for mistakes in a person's gene to try to determine if it is a mistake or if it's not a mistake, we have to look at other people. We do this because people are 99.9% similar in their DNA. So if we look at other people and we see broadly what other people have in this particular section of their DNA, we can try to figure out if our patient of interest has a mistake there. So here's an analogy for that. Let's say we're looking at a series of DNA. We've got lots of different people and we've collected the same section of DNA from all the different people. So the analogy here is that instead of using DNA, we've collected sentences. Sentences are like the DNA from different people. And we can see that most of the sentences from all the people that we've collected are exactly identical, but we can also see that there are a couple of mistakes. So we find the mistakes, but we can look around, and given what other people have in their sentence, we can be pretty sure we know which ones are the mistakes. The problem is that when we find these mistakes, so we've identified that the sentence probably shouldn't say the dog has pear paws. We know that that's a mistake, but we don't necessarily know how bad of a mistake that is. We can classify it in a couple of different ways. We can say, well, that's definitely fine. It's not going to cause a problem. It might be probably fine. It might be definitely bad, or it might be probably bad. But sometimes we're really not sure how terrible of a problem it's going to be if we found a mistake in a DNA. So I want to give you an analogy on exactly what I mean by this. How we know sometimes that something is bad and sometimes we're not so sure. So here's a couple of examples. Here's an analogy, and again we're going back to words to represent the DNA. So I've put 3 English words here: buses, fusses, and wusses. And I chose the word wusses for purposes because it's the only word that would match this pattern that I'm going to explain. And for those of you too sophisticated to know what the word wuss means, it's a slang word meaning chicken, hence the chicken pictures. So that is why that is there. So we've got these 3 words, these 3 genes, and say we're now noticing that we've found some mistakes in the genes and we want to know what it means. So with the word bus, the mistake is that we lost one of the S's in the word bus, analogous to finding a mistake in a gene. Well, the word bus can actually be spelled with 1 S or 2 S's, so we still have that exact same word, so that mistake isn't going to be a problem at all, and we know that for sure. Now let's look at the word fusses. We've got the same mistake. We lost part of the word. We've got another mistake in this gene. Well, that word is actually fuses, and that's a different word, so that's probably not okay, and that's pretty clear. But with the word wusses, now if we have a mistake and we lose an S, well, that word is woozes. That's a different word. That's not even a word. We don't know what that means. We are completely unsure. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's a mistake in a book, in a footnote at the end of the book that nobody reads anyways, but maybe it's really going to throw the book off and we don't know how problematic it will be. So this is just an example to show that when you get mistakes in DNA, if you found that mistake, that's one step, but knowing what it means and how bad it is another step, and sometimes it's not that clear. Particularly because in cases of child abuse versus brittle bone disease, there's a lot of key players that have to interpret these genetic tests. Sometimes it's physicians, but sometimes it's social workers, defense attorneys, or prosecuting attorneys, and not all of these people have training in how to interpret a genetic test result. So if they get something like woozes, they might not know what to do with that or how bad it's going to be, and they might not know how to make a call on a ruling if they think that this genetic test helps mean that a child has been abused or hasn't been abused, just because they haven't had that training and might not know what to do with it. So at the University of Washington, part of the research that I'm involved in is to understand more about how physicians, social workers, and lawyers use these genetic tests. We want to understand how much they know, how much they are getting wrong, and what we can do to try to make their misdiagnosis of brittle bone disease versus child abuse better. We'd also like to talk to patients to try to get them to be more open to sharing information confidentially so that we can understand more about if there's a mistake somewhere in a gene, we can learn more about what kind of what that might cause, if it causes brittle bone disease or not, so that if we can collect more information, it will improve the diagnostic accuracy of this test. So again, some of the future goals: improve accuracy of test interpretation. We would like to mandate awareness among stakeholders. At the beginning of this talk, we talked about the story with Bethany and Harrison, where some of the stakeholders were not aware of brittle bone disease. Some of the social workers hadn't been informed, so we'd like to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. And we'd also like to require that any child, even suspected of being abused, gets tested for brittle bone disease so that we can rule that out straight away. Ultimately, the goal of this is just to make it less often that we have families that are being unnecessarily disrupted, just like Bethany and Harrison here. Next week, starting tomorrow, is actually Brittle Bone Awareness Week. So from the 2nd to the 9th of May, there's going to be a couple of awareness events going on all over the country. The scientific name for brittle bone disease is osteogenesis imperfecta. So if you are looking up brittle bone disease online, I hope you do some more research on it after this talk. You will probably see it most often referred to as osteogenesis imperfecta. The 6th of May is International Awareness Day. It's called Wishbone Day, and this is just a day to celebrate the people that do have brittle bone disease and to make it very clear that these people are real people that have real lives, and it's a day to let people know that they are very strong and to be inspired by these people that do have brittle bone disease. The 8th of May is Blue Jeans Day, and this is a fundraising day to collect more money to put into research for brittle bone disease. So I have some people to thank. On the left, these are people involved in my research at the University of Washington, and on the right, UW Engage program, Town Hall, and of course, thank you to all of you for being here. I put my email at the bottom in case anyone has any questions, and I'll take some questions right now. Thank you so much.
Great talk, thanks. I was wondering how common it is for misdiagnosis of brittle bone disease as child abuse and vice versa, since you said it happens the other way, or it could the other way.
Yeah, great question, thank you. We have done some calculations. We think that the upper limit of misdiagnosis in the United States is about 440 people who have brittle bone disease who are misdiagnosed as child abuse. They generally don't go so far as having the parents in jail for a year and a half, but because it is so often misdiagnosed, now it's getting, the number we hope will be shrinking. We are pretty sure it's going down, but the upper limits are in the 400s. We think the more accurate number is probably around the mid 200s that this is happening in the United States. It's much less frequent to go the other way around, that a child who is being abused is misdiagnosed as having brittle bone disease. We think it happens in the very small 5 or 6 times per year in the United States. But we'd like for all of these misdiagnoses to be 0.
So you said part of your research is to start educating the key players on genetic tests to make them more aware. What are some of the actual efforts you're doing to do this? Are there classes or?
We would like to implement the training for this into these people's mandatory training, so into medical school if they're for physicians, or into grad school for social work. We would just like to get this awareness out there and make sure that this is at some point being integrated into their curriculum. So for part of my research, I'm spending a lot of time talking to lawyers and social workers and asking them how often this comes up, how often they've heard of it. And for people that haven't had a case, most of them never heard of it at all. And for people that have had a case where it came up, that was the first that they'd ever heard of it. And we'd really like for it to not be the case that when they get a patient who has brittle bone disease, that's the first time that they're ever hearing of it. So we're working on getting it into these curriculums in graduate and professional school right now.
You said there's a wide variety of spectrum. I was wondering if you knew why that is. Is there like a difference in the collagen, and what happens if there's such a variety in the spectrum of the disease?
Yeah, so what causes the huge variance in phenotype and the way it looks is what the mistake in the DNA is and where it is. So for example, if the mistake in the gene is way far at the very end of the gene, it's going to be a much less severe case than something that happens at the beginning, because as the gene is going along and making collagen, if the problem happens right at the beginning, not very much collagen is going to be made. So those bones will be very, very fragile. If the mistake is way at the end of the gene, end of the book, for example, it doesn't throw off that much if it's way at the end. It also might be a difference in what the mistake is. So if the mistake is a single one letter change in a word, for example, then that one word isn't going to make that much of a difference. But say a word is deleted and then everything else in the book shifts over, now you have a really big problem. So it depends where the mistake is in the gene and also what the mistake is. Great, thank you so much.